Princess Zaratiel stood at the massive viewing window of the royal palace, watching the twin suns of Velterra cast long shadows across the crystalline spires of her homeworld. Her violet skin shimmered with bioluminescent patterns that betrayed her inner turmoil, despite her attempts to maintain royal composure. Tomorrow, she would be wed to Prince Corvex of the Drachmarie Empire, sealing a political alliance that would save her people from economic collapse but condemn her to a lifetime of misery. The Velthari were a proud species, tall and graceful with elongated limbs and large, intelligent eyes that could see across multiple light spectrums. Their society valued honor, artistic expression, and scientific advancement above all else. But their peaceful nature had made them vulnerable to the aggressive expansion of neighboring empires, and now they faced a choice between subjugation through marriage or destruction through war. Zaratiel had studied the reports about her betrothed extensively. Prince Corvex was known throughout the galaxy for his cruelty and sadistic nature. The Drachmarie were a warrior species, resembling massive reptilian humanoids with thick armored hides and razor-sharp claws. They conquered worlds not just for resources, but for the pleasure of domination. The prince had already gone through 3 wives, each meeting mysterious and violent ends after producing heirs for the throne. "My lady," came a soft voice from behind her. Zaratiel turned to see her personal aide, Telmari, approaching with obvious reluctance. "The ceremonial preparations are ready for your approval." Zaratiel's bioluminescent patches flickered with resignation. "I suppose I should be grateful that my sacrifice will save billions of lives," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality typical of her species. "But I cannot help but wonder if there might be another way." Telmari's own pattern shifted to deep blue, indicating sadness. "The Council has explored every option, Princess. The Drachmarie fleet is already in our system. If the wedding does not proceed as planned..." "I know," Zaratiel interrupted gently. "I know the consequences. I had hoped to see more of the galaxy before being caged forever." What neither of them knew was that their conversation was being monitored by more than just palace security. Far beyond the planet's atmosphere, drifting among the asteroid belt that surrounded Velterra, a small human salvage vessel called the Rusty Nail was picking up transmissions from the planet below. Jake Morrison wiped grease from his hands with an already filthy rag and frowned at the readings on his communication scanner. The 30-year-old mechanic had been working the Outer Rim territories for the better part of a decade, salvaging derelict ships and selling spare parts to anyone who could pay. His weathered face bore scars from a dozen close calls, and his brown hair had started showing gray at the temples despite his relatively young age. Humans were still considered a relatively new species in galactic politics. They had achieved faster-than-light travel only 2 centuries ago and were viewed by most alien civilizations as crude, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. While some species admired human ingenuity and adaptability, others saw them as barely civilized barbarians who had stumbled onto advanced technology they didn't deserve. Jake had heard the stories about human unpredictability from countless alien traders and merchants. Most species in the galaxy had evolved along fairly predictable paths, developing either as warriors, scholars, merchants, or workers. Humans seemed to embody aspects of all these categories simultaneously, making them difficult for other species to understand or categorize. "Well, that doesn't sound good," Jake muttered to himself as he listened to the intercepted transmissions. His universal translator was working overtime to convert the melodious Velthari language into something he could understand, but the meaning was clear enough. An alien princess was being forced into marriage to prevent a war. Jake's ship, while small and battered, was equipped with some of the most advanced scanning and communication equipment he could afford. Years of salvaging had taught him the value of good intel, and his systems were constantly monitoring local communications for information about derelict ships, space battles, or other profitable opportunities. But this was different. Jake had always prided himself on staying out of local politics and conflicts. His business was salvage, not heroics. Yet something about the princess's situation reminded him of his own sister, Sarah, who had died in a mining accident on Mars when he was just a teenager. She had always dreamed of seeing the stars, but had been trapped by circumstances beyond her control. "Damn it," Jake said, running his hands through his hair. He looked around his small ship's workshop, taking in the various alien technologies he had modified and improved over the years. The rusty nail might not look like much, but it was fast, well-armed, and equipped with systems that most species considered impossible for humans to understand, let alone improve upon. Jake activated his ship's advanced sensors and began scanning the Velthari system more thoroughly. What he found made him whistle in amazement. The Drakmari fleet was massive, consisting of dozens of heavy cruisers and battleships arranged in a perfect blockade formation around the planet. Any attempt to leave or enter the system would be met with overwhelming force. But Jake had spent years studying alien ship designs and their weaknesses. The Drakmari were indeed formidable warriors, but they were also predictable. Their ships were heavily armored and powerfully armed, but they relied on brute force rather than subtlety or innovation. Their formations were textbook perfect, which also made them somewhat inflexible. As Jake continued his analysis, he began to notice something interesting about the Drakmari communication patterns. The alien ships were using standard military encryption, but their protocols were based on centuries-old traditions that prioritized honor and directness over security. A skilled hacker with the right equipment might be able to exploit those traditions. This is insane, Jake told himself, even as he began plotting possible infiltration routes. I'm a mechanic, not a knight in shining armor. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that being a mechanic might actually be an advantage. Most alien species had rigid caste systems that clearly separated warriors, scholars, workers, and rulers. They wouldn't expect a simple tradesman to pose any real threat to their operations. Jake spent the next several hours studying the layout of the Velthari capital city and the palace where the wedding ceremony would take place. The Velthari had built their civilization around principles of beauty and harmony, with flowing architecture that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape. It was a stark contrast to the angular, fortress-like designs favored by the Drakmari. The wedding was scheduled to take place in exactly 36 standard hours. Jake knew that once the ceremony was complete, the princess would be taken aboard the Drakmari flagship and transported to the Empire's home system. After that, any rescue attempt would be virtually impossible. Jake had always been good with his hands and had an intuitive understanding of how mechanical systems worked. But his real talent was in seeing connections that others missed. He had modified his ship's engines using principles borrowed from 6 different alien technologies, creating a hybrid system that was more efficient than any of the original designs. As he studied the Drakmari fleet positions, Jake began to see patterns and weaknesses that might not be apparent to a traditional military strategist. The aliens had arranged their ships to prevent any large-scale assault, but they had left gaps that a small, fast vessel might be able to exploit. The key would be timing and misdirection. Jake would need to make his move during the wedding ceremony, when the Drakmari would be focused on the political symbolism of the event rather than potential security threats. He would also need to find a way to communicate with the princess and convince her to trust him. Jake activated his ship's fabrication systems and began working on specialized equipment for the mission. He created a portable holographic projector that could disguise his human appearance, making him look like one of several neutral species that commonly worked as traders and mechanics throughout the galaxy. He also modified a standard engineering toolkit to include some decidedly non-standard capabilities. Sarah would have loved this, Jake said quietly, thinking of his sister as he worked. She had always been fascinated by alien cultures and had dreamed of becoming a diplomat or cultural ambassador. She would have said that sometimes the right thing to do is also the crazy thing to do. As the twin suns of Velterra began to set, casting the palace in shades of amber and crimson, Jake made his final preparations. He had identified a maintenance worker's entrance to the palace that was connected to the building's environmental systems. If he could get inside during the pre-ceremony setup, he might be able to reach the princess before the wedding began. The plan was risky, relying on quick thinking and mechanical expertise rather than military might. But Jake had learned long ago that sometimes the best solution to a complex problem was the simplest one. He wasn't trying to defeat the Drakmari fleet in battle or overthrow their empire. He just needed to get one person off the planet before it was too late. Jake checked his equipment one final time and began the approach to Velterra. His ship's stealth systems would hide him from casual observation, but once he entered the planet's atmosphere, there would be no turning back. He thought about all the reasons why this was a terrible idea, but he also thought about the sadness he had heard in Princess Zaratiel's voice. Well, Jake, he said to himself as he began atmospheric entry, let's see if a human mechanic can pull off a miracle. The rusty nail descended through Velterra's upper atmosphere like a falling star, its hull heating up from friction despite the advanced shielding systems Jake had installed. The planet's surface grew larger in his viewports, revealing a world of incredible beauty. Crystalline cities rose from landscapes of purple vegetation, connected by flowing bridges that seemed to defy conventional engineering principles. Jake had visited dozens of alien worlds, but Velterra was something special. The Velthari had built their civilization in harmony with their environment rather than dominating it. Rivers and forests flowed through their cities, and their buildings seemed to pulse with the same bioluminescent patterns displayed by the species themselves. As he guided his ship toward the coordinates he had identified for the palace complex, Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of anger at the Drachmae. This beautiful world and its peaceful people were about to be conquered through political manipulation and the threat of violence. It was exactly the kind of bullying that had driven Jake to leave human space in the first place. The maintenance entrance he had identified was located in a service facility several kilometers from the main palace. Jake landed his ship in a grove of crystalline trees that would hide it from aerial observation and began his final preparations. The holographic disguise he had created would make him appear to be a Zentari, a species known throughout the galaxy for their mechanical expertise and political neutrality. Jake activated the disguise and checked his appearance in a mirror. The hologram was nearly perfect, transforming his human features into the blue-scaled, four-armed appearance typical of Zentari technicians. As long as no one looked too closely or tried to touch him, the illusion would hold. The princess's wedding was less than 18 hours away, and Jake knew that time was running out. He gathered his modified tools and began making his way toward the palace, moving carefully through the alien landscape and trying to look like just another maintenance worker reporting for duty. As he walked, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to change the course of galactic history. Not through conquest or diplomacy, but through the simple act of one person refusing to let injustice go unchallenged. It was a very human response to an impossible situation, and Jake hoped it would be enough. Jake's disguise worked better than he had hoped. The Zentari were well known throughout the galaxy as skilled technicians who kept to themselves and asked few questions. Palace security guards barely glanced at him as he approached the service entrance, simply assuming he was part of the maintenance crew preparing for the royal wedding. The service tunnels beneath the palace were a marvel of Velthari engineering. Crystalline conduits carried energy throughout the building like veins of light, while environmental systems maintained perfect atmospheric conditions using principles Jake had never encountered before. Despite the urgency of his mission, he found himself admiring the elegant solutions to complex technical problems. Jake's modified scanner was picking up dozens of different energy signatures as he made his way through the tunnels. The Velthari had integrated their technology so seamlessly with their architecture that the entire palace was essentially one massive organism. It was beautiful, but it also meant that any significant damage could bring down the entire structure. Following the blueprints he had downloaded from intercepted communications, Jake navigated toward the royal quarters where Princess Zaratiel would be making her final preparations. The tunnels were mostly empty except for automated systems and the occasional maintenance drone, giving him free movement throughout the lower levels of the palace. As he climbed through an access shaft toward the upper floors, Jake could hear the sounds of preparation echoing through the walls. Servants were arranging flowers, musicians were tuning their instruments, and security personnel were conducting final sweeps. The entire palace was buzzing with activity as the most important political event in Velthari history approached. Jake emerged from the access shaft into a maintenance closet adjacent to the royal wing. Through the thin walls, he could hear voices speaking in the melodious Velthari language. His translator indicated that Princess Zaratiel was discussing final arrangements with her advisors, her voice carrying undertones of resignation and barely suppressed fear. The traditional ceremonial crown will be presented by Prince Corvex himself, one advisor was saying. You must accept it gracefully and recite the binding vows exactly as written. Any deviation could be interpreted as an insult to the Drachmae and might provoke the very war we are trying to avoid. I understand my duty, the princess replied, though Jake could detect the strain in her voice even through the translation. I will play my part perfectly, as I have been trained to do since childhood. Jake waited until the advisors had left before carefully opening the maintenance panel that provided access to the princess's private chambers. The room beyond was a masterpiece of Valtheri design, with walls that seemed to flow like liquid crystal and furniture that appeared to have grown from the floor itself. Soft bioluminescent patterns provided gentle lighting that matched the princess's own natural glow. Princess Zaratiel was standing before a mirror, studying her reflection with obvious distaste. She was wearing traditional Valtheri formal attire that accentuated her natural beauty, but her bioluminescent patterns were flickering with patterns that Jake's scanner identified as indicating extreme stress and unhappiness. "Your Highness," Jake said quietly, deactivating his holographic disguise as he stepped into the room. "I need to speak with you." The princess spun around, her large eyes widening in shock as she saw a human standing in her private chambers. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted to bright orange and red, indicating alarm and confusion. What are you doing here?" she demanded, though she kept her voice low to avoid alerting the guards outside her door. "Humans are not permitted in the royal quarters." "My name is Jake Morrison," he said, raising his hands to show he meant no threat. "I'm here because I intercepted communications about your situation, and I think there might be another way." Zaratiel's patterns shifted to deep blue, indicating skepticism and wariness. "Another way to what? To prevent the conquest of my world? The Drakmari fleet surrounds us completely. Even if I were to refuse this marriage, my people would still face annihilation." Jake pulled out a small device that projected a three-dimensional hologram of the Veltari system, showing the positions of all the Drakmari ships. "I've been studying their formation for the past day," he explained. "The Drakmari are powerful, but they're also predictable. They've positioned their fleet to prevent any large-scale assault, but they've left gaps that a small ship could exploit." The princess stared at the hologram with growing amazement. "You're suggesting that we could escape? But even if that were possible, what about my people? I cannot abandon them to face the consequences of my actions." "That's where human unpredictability comes in," Jake said with a slight smile. "The Drakmari expect you to either submit or fight. They're not prepared for a third option." Jake manipulated the hologram to show a new scenario. "What if you disappeared during the wedding ceremony, but in a way that looked like you had been kidnapped by a hostile third party? The Drakmari would be insulted, but they wouldn't blame your people for something that was done to them rather than by them." Zaratiel's pattern shifted to yellow and green, indicating intense thought and cautious hope. "You mean to stage my abduction? But who would the Drakmari blame for such an act? Space pirates, raiders, or any number of criminal organizations that operate in this sector," Jake replied. "The galaxy is full of groups that might attempt such a bold theft for the ransom value alone. If we do this right, the Drakmari will spend their time hunting for mysterious kidnappers instead of conquering your world." The princess walked to her window and stared out at the Drakmari ships hanging in the sky like metal vultures. "And what becomes of me in this plan? I cannot hide forever, and eventually they will discover the truth." "Not if we don't stop with just getting you off the planet," Jake said. "I've been thinking about this for hours, and I have an idea that might solve the bigger problem. But it would require you to trust a human stranger with not just your life, but the fate of your entire civilization." Zaratiel turned back to face him, her patterns now showing a complex mixture of curiosity, fear, and determination. "Tell me your plan." Jake expanded the hologram to show a much larger view of the local galactic sector. "The Drakmari Empire is powerful, but they're not the only major power in this region. The Zentari Federation, the Kythera Republic, and the Human Colonial Union all have interests in maintaining the balance of power. None of them want to see the Drakmari become too dominant." "You're suggesting some kind of alliance?" the princess asked. "But the Velthari have little to offer such powers. We are artists and scientists, not warriors or traders." "That's exactly what makes you valuable," Jake explained. "The Velthari are respected throughout the galaxy for your neutrality and wisdom. If you were to formally request protection from the other major powers, citing the Drakmari's use of forced marriage as a form of conquest, you could create a legal justification for intervention." Jake brought up another section of the hologram showing various diplomatic treaties and agreements. The Zentari Federation in particular has been looking for an excuse to check Drakmari expansion. They're natural enemies, but they've avoided direct confrontation because the Drachmari have been careful not to violate any major galactic laws. Forced marriage as a form of conquest, however, could be interpreted as a violation of several treaties protecting sovereign worlds. Zaratiel's patterns were now shifting rapidly between different colors as she processed the implications. You're saying that my abduction could become the catalyst for a larger diplomatic intervention? Exactly, Jake confirmed. But the timing has to be perfect, and we need to make sure that your disappearance is seen as an attack on Velthari sovereignty rather than a personal choice. The other powers need to be able to frame their response as protecting galactic law rather than interfering in Drachmari internal affairs. The princess began pacing back and forth, her graceful movements betraying her agitation. This plan is incredibly risky. If it fails, not only will I face the prince's wrath, but my people could face even greater retaliation. All the best plans are risky, Jake said. But the alternative is accepting a future where the Drachmari gradually absorb every peaceful civilization in this sector. Sometimes the only way to prevent a greater evil is to take a calculated risk. Zaratiel stopped pacing and looked directly at Jake. Why are you doing this? What do you gain from helping us? Humans have a reputation for acting only in their own self-interest. Jake was quiet for a moment, thinking about his sister and all the dreams that had died with her. Maybe that reputation isn't entirely accurate. Maybe sometimes humans do things just because they're the right things to do. The princess studied his face for a long moment, her bioluminescent pattern shifting to soft purple, indicating deep thought and evaluation. I can see why your species is considered unpredictable. Very well, Jake Morrison. Tell me exactly what you need me to do. Jake outlined his plan in detail. During the wedding ceremony, when all attention would be focused on the royal pavilion, Jake would trigger a carefully orchestrated distraction using the palace's own systems. In the confusion that followed, he would extract the princess through the service tunnels and get her to his ship. The key is making it look like professionals planned this, Jake explained. We need to leave evidence that suggests a well-organized criminal operation, complete with inside information and advanced technology. That will support the theory that you were targeted by external forces rather than escaping on your own. And then, the princess asked. Then, we run, Jake said simply. We get you to neutral space where you can formally request asylum and protection from the other galactic powers. I've already identified several diplomatic stations that would be required by law to hear your petition. Zaratiel nodded slowly. And if the Drachmari pursue us? That's where my ship's modifications come in handy, Jake replied with more confidence than he actually felt. I've spent years improving systems that most species consider impossible for humans to understand. The rusty nail might not look like much, but she's fast enough to outrun anything the Drachmari have. The princess walked to her desk and activated a small communications device. Telmari, please come to my chambers immediately. And ensure that we are not disturbed or monitored for the next hour. When her aide arrived, Princess Zaratiel explained the situation and the plan. Telmari's patterns immediately shifted to bright red, indicating extreme alarm and disbelief. Princess, this is madness, Telmari protested. To trust our entire civilization's fate to a human we have just met? The risks are enormous. The risks of doing nothing are even greater, Zaratiel replied firmly. At least this plan offers hope for the future. The alternative is certain subjugation. Jake spent the next hour working with the princess and her aide to refine the plan and prepare for the mission. He used his engineering expertise to identify the best points to trigger system failures that would create the necessary confusion, while Zaratiel used her knowledge of palace protocols to determine the optimal timing for the escape. The ceremony begins at the next sun peak, the princess explained. The traditional vows are exchanged first, followed by the presentation of gifts. That would be the best time to act, when the prince and his retinue are focused on the ritual rather than security concerns. Jake nodded and began setting up the devices he would need to trigger the distractions. I'll need about 15 minutes to get into position in the service tunnels. When you see the first system failure, begin moving toward the maintenance access point we discussed. I'll meet you there. And if something goes wrong? Telmari asked, her pattern still showing deep concern. Then, we improvise, Jake said. Humans are supposed to be good at that. As the time for the ceremony approached, Jake made his way back to the service tunnels while Princess Zaratiel began her final preparations. The palace was now filled with Drachmarie guests and officials, their massive reptilian forms creating a stark contrast to the elegant Velthari architecture. From his position in the tunnels, Jake could monitor the ceremony through the palace's internal sensor network. He watched as Prince Corvex arrived in full ceremonial armor, his scarred face displaying what passed for a smile among his species. The prince was even larger and more intimidating than the intelligence reports had suggested, with cybernetic implants that spoke to a lifetime of violence and warfare. "This is it," Jake whispered to himself as the ceremony began. "Time to find out if a human mechanic can really change the course of galactic history." Jake positioned his hands over the control panel he had modified to access the palace's primary systems. In a few moments, he would either pull off the most audacious rescue in galactic history, or he would doom both himself and the princess to fates worse than death. But, as he thought about his sister Sarah and all the dreams that had been crushed by circumstances beyond anyone's control, Jake knew he had to try. The ceremony was reaching the critical moment when the vows would be exchanged. Jake could see Princess Zaratiel standing beside the massive form of Prince Corvex, her bioluminescent patterns carefully controlled to show the appropriate responses. To outside observers, she appeared to be a willing bride, but Jake could see the subtle signs of her true feelings in the patterns that others wouldn't recognize. For Sarah, Jake said quietly, and triggered the first system failure. The first system failure was subtle but effective. The ceremonial lighting dimmed slightly, and the bioluminescent patterns in the palace walls began flickering irregularly. To the Velthari guests, it appeared to be a minor technical malfunction. To the Drachmarie security forces, it was the first sign that something was wrong. Jake waited exactly 90 seconds before triggering the second failure. This time, he shut down the atmospheric recycling system for the eastern wing of the palace, causing environmental alarms to sound throughout the building. Palace staff immediately began evacuating guests from the affected areas, creating the confusion Jake needed. From his position in the service tunnels, Jake could hear Prince Corvex bellowing orders in the harsh Drachmarie language. The prince was demanding that his security forces investigate the malfunctions while simultaneously insisting that the ceremony continue as planned. The Drachmarie did not believe in allowing technical difficulties to interfere with matters of honor and politics. Princess Zaratiel was playing her part perfectly. Jake could see her through the palace sensors, appearing concerned about the technical problems while subtly moving toward the location where they had planned to meet. Her bioluminescent patterns showed appropriate worry about the safety of her guests, masking her true intentions. "Third time's the charm," Jake muttered, and triggered the final and most dramatic system failure. The palace's main power grid suffered a cascading failure that plunged half the building into darkness while sending power surges through the other half. Emergency lighting activated throughout the complex, but the sudden shift from the gentle bioluminescent illumination to harsh artificial light created chaos among the guests who were not adapted to such dramatic changes. Jake moved quickly through the service tunnels, using his knowledge of the palace's layout to reach the rendezvous point where Princess Zaratiel would be waiting. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of confused guests, shouting guards, and the increasingly angry demands of Prince Corvex for explanations and solutions. The princess was already at the maintenance access point when Jake arrived, having excused herself from the ceremony under the pretense of ensuring the safety of her guests. Her elaborate ceremonial robes had been replaced with more practical clothing that would allow for rapid movement. "The Drachmarie are already sealing the exits," she reported quietly. "They suspect this might be more than technical difficulties." "That's actually good," Jake replied, helping her into the access tunnel. "The more suspicious they get, the more this looks like a professional operation rather than an accident." They moved quickly through the tunnels toward Jake's ship, but progress was slower than he had hoped due to the princess's unfamiliarity with the maintenance areas. Jake had spent hours studying the layout, but Zaratiel had never had reason to learn about the practical infrastructure of her own palace. As they made their way through the lower levels, Jake's scanner picked up movement in the tunnels behind them. The Drachmarie security forces were conducting a systematic search of the entire palace complex, and they were getting closer to the escape route. "We need to move faster," Jake said, but he could see that the princess was already struggling to keep pace. The Velthari were not built for rapid movement through confined spaces, and her ceremonial training had not included anything resembling military-style escape procedures. "Go without me," Zaratiel said, breathing heavily from the exertion. "You have done more than enough already. I will not let your sacrifice be wasted because I cannot keep up." "Nobody gets left behind," Jake said firmly, echoing a principle he had learned from human military traditions. "We're going to make it out together, or not at all." Jake quickly assessed their situation and came up with an alternative plan. Instead of continuing through the tunnels to the original exit point, he led the princess to a maintenance shaft that would take them directly to the surface near the grove where his ship was hidden. "This is going to be a tight fit," Jake warned as they approached the vertical shaft. "But it will get us out faster than trying to outrun the search teams." The climb was difficult, especially for Princess Zaratiel, who had never encountered anything like the cramped maintenance shafts. But her determination to save her people gave her the strength to push through the physical challenges, and Jake's encouragement helped her maintain focus on the goal. They emerged from the shaft into the crystalline grove just as the palace's external security systems began activating. Searchlights swept across the landscape while automated patrols launched to secure the perimeter. The Drachmari were taking no chances that whoever was responsible for the disruption might escape. Jake's ship was exactly where he had left it, hidden among the crystal trees and camouflaged by its advanced stealth systems. But even as they approached the Rusty Nail, Jake could see Drachmari fighters beginning to patrol the airspace above the palace. "Can your ship really outrun those fighters?" Princess Zaratiel asked, looking up at the alien aircraft with obvious concern. "We're about to find out," Jake replied, activating his ship systems remotely. "But first, we need to make sure they know you've been kidnapped rather than rescued." Jake had prepared several items designed to support the kidnapping narrative. He scattered some generic criminal organization symbols around the area where they had emerged from the maintenance shaft, along with traces of explosive compounds that would suggest the use of breaching charges. He also planted a small communication device that would broadcast a ransom demand in several hours, well after they had escaped. "This evidence will support the theory that you were taken by professional criminals," Jake explained as they boarded his ship. "The Drachmari will waste time trying to track down the supposed kidnappers instead of immediately retaliating against your people." The Rusty Nail's engines came online with a barely audible hum, a testament to the modifications Jake had made over the years. The ship's power systems were based on technology borrowed from 6 different species, creating a hybrid design that was more efficient and quieter than any conventional drive system. "Launching in 3, 2, 1, Jake said, and the ship lifted off from the grove with minimal disturbance to the surrounding vegetation. The first few minutes of flight were the most dangerous. Jake had to get his ship clear of the planet's atmosphere without being detected by either the Drachmari patrols or the palace's own defense systems. He used every stealth technique he had learned during his years as a salvage operator, flying low through valleys and using the planet's natural crystal formations to break up his ship's sensor signature. Princess Zaratiel watched the planet's surface fall away below them, her bioluminescent pattern shifting through a complex sequence of colors that Jake's translator identified as indicating grief, determination, and hope all mixed together. "I have never left Velterra before," she said quietly. "I always imagined my first journey to the stars would be under different circumstances." "We'll get you home again," Jake promised. "But first, we need to make sure there's still a home to return to." The real test came as they reached the edge of the planet's atmosphere and encountered the Drachmari blockade. Jake's sensors showed dozens of massive warships positioned to intercept any vessel attempting to leave the system, their weapons powered and ready to fire at the first sign of unauthorized movement. "How do we get past them?" the princess asked, staring at the tactical display with amazement. "There must be 50 ships out there." "We don't go around them," Jake said, making final adjustments to his ship's systems. "We go through them." Jake had identified a gap in the Drachmari formation that would only be accessible for a few minutes as the ships adjusted their positions. It was a window of opportunity that would require precise timing and more luck than skill, but it was their only chance to escape without engaging in a fight they couldn't win. "Hold on," Jake warned, and pushed his ship's engines to maximum power. The Rusty Nail shot through space like a bullet, its modified drive systems allowing it to accelerate faster than the Drachmari sensors could track. Jake's years of experience navigating asteroid fields and debris zones served him well as he threaded his ship between the massive alien warships, using their own bulk to mask his approach. For a heart-stopping moment, it looked like they might make it through undetected. Then, one of the Drachmarie sensor operators noticed the anomalous readings and raised an alarm. "Unknown vessel, you are in violation of the Valterra blockade," came a transmission in the harsh Drachmarie language. "Reduce velocity and prepare to be boarded, or you will be destroyed." "Not today," Jake replied, switching his communications to a broad-spectrum emergency frequency. "Mayday, Mayday, this is merchant vessel Rusty Nail. We are under attack by unknown forces. Requesting immediate assistance from any ships in the area." The distress call was a calculated risk. It would identify Jake as human and potentially draw unwanted attention from other species, but it would also create a paper trail that supported the narrative they were trying to establish. If anyone investigated the princess's disappearance, they would find records of a human merchant who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Drachmarie fighters were fast, but they were designed for conventional space combat rather than pursuit missions. Jake's ship, on the other hand, had been optimized for exactly this type of situation. Its engines could sustain higher velocities for longer periods, and its smaller size allowed it to make course corrections that would be impossible for larger vessels. "They're falling behind," Princess Zaratiel observed, watching the tactical display as the Drachmarie ships gradually lost ground. "The hardest part is still ahead of us," Jake replied. "We need to reach neutral space before they can organize a proper pursuit fleet." The journey to the nearest diplomatic station took 18 hours of hard flying through some of the most dangerous regions of local space. Jake had to navigate through asteroid fields, radiation zones, and areas known to be frequented by actual space pirates. Several times they detected other ships on their sensors, but Jake's modifications allowed them to avoid contact. Princess Zaratiel spent much of the journey learning about human culture and history, fascinated by the species that had risked so much to help her. Jake found himself explaining concepts like individual choice, democratic government, and the human belief that all sapient beings deserved freedom from oppression. "Your species is indeed as unpredictable as the reports suggest," the princess observed. "But perhaps that is exactly what the galaxy needs right now." When they finally reached the Zentari diplomatic station, Princess Zaratiel was ready to make her case for asylum and protection. The station's administrators were initially skeptical of her claims, but the evidence Jake had prepared and the princess's own testimony quickly convinced them that this was a legitimate case of forced political marriage being used as a tool of conquest. Within hours of their arrival, the Zentari Federation formally petitioned the Galactic Council to investigate the Drachmarie Empire's actions on Valterra. The Human Colonial Union and several other major powers added their voices to the petition, creating the diplomatic crisis that Jake had hoped for. The Drachmarie, meanwhile, were indeed spending their time and resources hunting for the mysterious criminals who had supposedly kidnapped the princess. The ransom demand that Jake had programmed sent them on a wild chase through the Outer Rim territories, following false leads and chasing shadows while the diplomatic situation developed. 3 months later, Princess Zaratiel stood before the Galactic Council as the newly elected president of the Valtheri Republic. The diplomatic intervention had forced the Drachmarie to withdraw their fleet, and the threat of economic sanctions from the other major powers had convinced them to abandon their conquest plans. The Valtheri had used the crisis as an opportunity to restructure their government, moving from a hereditary monarchy to an elected democracy that could better represent their people's interests in galactic affairs. Princess Zaratiel, now President Zaratiel, had been chosen to lead this transformation. Jake Morrison found himself appointed as the first human ambassador to the Valtheri Republic, a position that came with both tremendous honor and significant responsibility. His small salvage ship had been replaced with a proper diplomatic vessel, though he had insisted on keeping the name Rusty Nail as a reminder of where he had come from. "I still cannot fully understand why you risked everything for people you had never met," President Zaratiel said as they stood together on the observation deck of the new human embassy on Valterra. "Maybe that's what makes humans human," Jake replied, watching the twin suns set over the crystalline spires of the rebuilt capital city. "We don't always do things that make sense. Sometimes we just do things because they feel right." The Valtheri had indeed rebuilt their civilization, incorporating lessons learned from their encounter with both the Drachmarie threat and human unpredictability. Their new society balanced their traditional values of peace and artistic expression with a more practical understanding of galactic politics and the need for mutual defense agreements. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been political struggles, economic challenges, and the ongoing threat of Drachmarie retaliation. But the Velthari had proven more resilient than anyone, including themselves, had expected. The human concept of chosen family is fascinating, President Zaratiel continued, her bioluminescent patterns showing the warm colors associated with deep affection. You taught us that sometimes the strongest bonds are formed not by birth or obligation, but by shared commitment to doing what is right. Jake nodded, thinking about his sister Sarah and how proud she would have been to see what had grown from a simple act of defiance. The galaxy was still a dangerous place, full of species that preferred conquest to cooperation. But it was also a place where a human mechanic and an alien princess could work together to prove that freedom and dignity were worth fighting for. Besides, Jake added with a grin, somebody had to show the galaxy that humans are good for more than just making noise and breaking things. President Zaratiel's pattern shifted to the Velthari equivalent of laughter. I think you succeeded in that goal, Ambassador Morrison. Though I suspect the Drachmarie still consider your species to be dangerously unpredictable. Good, Jake replied. Let them keep thinking that. It'll make them think twice before trying to bully anyone else. As the years passed, the Velthari Republic became known throughout the galaxy as a symbol of successful resistance to conquest through forced alliance. Other peaceful civilizations facing similar threats began following the Velthari model, using diplomatic intervention and appeals to galactic law rather than accepting subjugation. Jake's role as ambassador evolved into something much larger, as he found himself coordinating mutual defense agreements between dozens of smaller civilizations and the major galactic powers. The human concept of collective security, or an attack on one member was considered an attack on all, proved to be remarkably effective at deterring aggression. The Drachmarie Empire, meanwhile, found their expansion significantly limited by the new diplomatic realities. Unable to use forced marriage and political manipulation as tools of conquest, they were forced to engage in more traditional forms of diplomacy and trade. Some observers noted that this actually improved relations between the Drachmarie and their neighbors, as it forced them to develop skills beyond military might. Prince Corvex himself eventually married a Drachmarie noble who was reportedly much better suited to his temperament, though Jake never inquired too closely about the details of that arrangement. Some stories were better left untold. But perhaps the most important legacy of the rescue mission was the example it set for future generations. Throughout the galaxy, the story of the human mechanic who saved an alien princess became a legend that inspired others to believe that individual actions could change the course of history. Young people of dozens of species grew up hearing about Jake Morrison and Princess Zaratiel, learning that sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons or armies, but with courage, creativity, and the simple refusal to accept that injustice was inevitable. Jake never considered himself a hero. He was still, at heart, a mechanic who preferred fixing things to breaking them. But he had learned that sometimes fixing the galaxy required more than just technical expertise. Sometimes it required the uniquely human belief that everyone deserved a chance to choose their own destiny. And, in a galaxy full of species that value tradition, hierarchy, and predictable outcomes, that kind of thinking was indeed revolutionary. It was a reminder that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't energy weapons or faster-than-light drives or even political authority. It was the simple idea that things could be better than they were, and that someone had to be willing to take the first step toward making that better future possible. For humanity, that step often began with a single person deciding to do what was right, regardless of the consequences. Jake Morrison had taken that step on a distant world, guided by the memory of a sister who had dreamed of seeing the stars. In doing so, he had proven that humans truly were as unpredictable as their reputation suggested, but in the best possible way. The galaxy was a little bit freer, a little bit safer, and a lot more interesting because one human had decided that an alien princess deserved better than a forced marriage to a monster. And that, Jake thought as he watched the stars appear in Velterra's night sky, was a pretty good legacy for a simple mechanic from the Outer Rim territories. Years later, when young diplomats and activists asked Jake for advice on how to change the galaxy, he always gave them the same answer: start with what's right in front of you. Fix what you can fix. Help who you can help. The rest will follow. It was advice that had served him well, and advice that continued to inspire others long after his small ship had first dropped out of hyperspace above a crystal world where an alien princess needed a miracle. Sometimes, Jake had learned, miracles came in the most unexpected packages. And sometimes they were delivered by the most unlikely heroes.